So as mentioned earlier, today's sermon considers the topic of adulthood and seeing providence in our adult years. Last week we considered childhood, and we followed the storyline of Moses as a baby being born under those very unusual circumstances, being put into an ark of bulrushes and then covered in tar. And that was a message about how the Lord protects us and cares for us in childhood in his providence. So today we consider this large topic of adulthood, and we are doing this by considering the call of Moses as it is recorded in Exodus chapter 3. And this call to Moses from the burning bush is a powerful illustration when you look at the details of how the Lord leads us as adults. And so again, wherever you are in this stage, the writings are very specific about this. The adulthood is defined as covering the years from our 20th year to our 60th year. And you may fall within that, you may be beyond that. But it's really important for us to reflect, as we reflect back on our life, how the Lord is leading us. And the details in this call to Moses have a very powerful lesson for us. It's no accident, perhaps, that in covering our adult years from our 20th year to our 60th, that is 40 years, and 40 years, of course, in Scripture, have to do with struggle and temptation. And one of the messages throughout this series is to remember that every stage of life has its delights and its challenges, and adulthood is no exception. But we're going to be zeroing in on a very specific feature or use of adulthood. And the answer may surprise you about how simple it is when you look back, if you're looking back on your life and saying, is that what my adulthood was all about? So stay tuned. To bring us into the context of today's story, Moses has left Egypt, his birthplace, and the land of his childhood and youth. And he has escaped to the land of Midian. This is all that comes before the call. He's now married and has children and has settled into the quiet rural life of a shepherd. And one day, he's leading his father-in-law's flock to the back of the desert and comes to Mount Horeb. And it is on this mountain that he receives the call from God. I'm going to do a quick recap and exposition of the steps, the detailed steps that Moses goes through as he's being called by the Lord to this task. And these details are not accidental. They all have to do with how the Lord shows us the workings of providence, how the Lord is leading us in our adult years and beyond. The first thing in this account is that Moses says, I will now turn aside and see this great thing. And I invite you to think about, if we're reflecting on seeing the Lord's providence, how many great things. And a great thing may not necessarily be a positive thing. It's just great, startling. It's a curiosity. So Moses says, I will now turn aside and see this great thing. That was key in order for everything else that follows, because the Lord didn't make the call or speak out from the bush until Moses said, I will turn aside. This has to do with reflection. When you look at the Arcana Celestia and the internal sense of this story, turning aside represents something that we do in adult life, and what we need to do in adult life, which is to spend time in reflection, reflecting and making it a practice, staying curious about our life, particularly our spiritual life, because this is how the Lord speaks to us. So once the Lord sees Moses, he turn aside, then it is then that the Lord calls out, Moses, Moses. And Moses says, here I am. One of the things about seeing providence is that we have to be able to put ourselves into the stream of providence in order to see it. And the Lord is always waiting for us to make the first move. So in the New Testament, the Lord speaks about this, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." And this idea of the Lord knocking on our mind is that the Lord cannot come in unless we open the door. And so unless Moses had turned aside to see this curious thing, there wouldn't have been any of these events happening. Then the Lord says, "Do not draw near." We can't see or understand the workings of divine providence unless we do these next steps. This first step being taking the sandals off our feet. And you heard in the lesson today that the removal of the shoes or the sandals represents creating a mental space that is removed or detached from our physical surroundings and our physical longings and wants. And we do this, again, if we are to see providence in action, because we are on holy ground. It says you need to remove the sandals from your feet because you are on holy ground. After all of these steps, then we get to the call. And the call is to Moses, "I need you to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt into the promised land." And with the call come all kinds of objections, which we didn't read. That was the next chapter, chapter 4. "Who am I to do this? Suppose they don't believe me. I'm not eloquent. Please send someone else." Does that sound like adult life? It's so hard. Why me? Why do I have to go through this? And so there's the call and the objections that contain our doubts and our worries and the uncertainty. So let's go to the definition that the teachings of our church give us about adulthood, because it's a different definition than the way that the world defines adulthood. As mentioned already, it goes from our 20th to our 60th year. And the hallmark of adulthood, from a spiritual perspective, is learning how to think and draw conclusions on our own. In essence, I'm going to be working this theme, but our adult life can really be summed up as this. This is what it's about: struggling to decide what it is that we want, what it is that we think and believe. And that may sound like such a simple thing, but we have 40 years of struggling with this, deciding what it is that we want. Our reading today said of this time in our life of adulthood, "At this time, belief begins. For belief is not our own until we have confirmed what we believe with ideas that are the product of our own thinking. Until then, the belief is not ours, but another's within us. For until then, we put our trust in what we've heard others say and not in the belief itself." So this stage of life is markedly different from our youth, which was a delightful time of learning all kinds of things, like sponges when we're young. It's an intense, kind of heady phase of life, gathering information. And the schooling of our youth teaches us a lot, but it's a borrowed knowledge based on the say-so of parents and teachers and professors. And again, as adults, something else needs to happen. As adults, we are truly on our own, making our own decisions, just as Moses was on his own in the wilderness, left to his own thoughts when he receives this call. I'd like to now focus in on this call, specifically the medium through which the Lord makes it. The Lord chose to call Moses from the midst of a bramble bush. Why a bramble bush? Well, in the explanation of this story in the Arcana Celestia, we're taught that when the Lord appears to people, he does so in a way suited to the kind of people they are, For a person cannot receive the divine in any other way. And this is true of the Lord's leading at every stage of life. The Lord meets us where we're at. Otherwise, we can't recognize him. We can't see what it is that he's doing. And the correspondence of this bramble bush is just wonderful. There are two particular things about the bramble bush and the call. One, that it's, if you think about a bramble bush, it's tangled. And the second thing is that it's on fire. Vegetation in the Lord's Word always has a good correspondence, and the bramble bush is no different. The bramble bush, with all its twists and turns and knots and crisscrossing, represents all of the important knowledge, the important truths that we have acquired over the years. But rather than lining up in our mind in an organized, linear, logical sequence, they appear tangled and prickly and unconnected. Again, they're not bad ideas, but it's a whole bunch of information that we've learned and knowledge that we've learned throughout our childhood and youth. And as adults, it seems like a big old bramble bush. But that's not the end of the story. There's also the fire. But let's first recall the distinguishing feature of adulthood again. It is a state in which understanding exists, of thinking for ourselves, drawing distinctions, and arriving at conclusions. It's up to us to make sense of all of this. So we could summarize these 40 years from our 20th to our 60th year of adulthood on a spiritual level as trying to figure stuff out. So if you've gone beyond that and you're still trying to figure stuff out, I think that's okay. We can stay tuned for the 60th year onwards, the age of wisdom, because a lot is going on when we're trying to figure things out. But I've never really thought of our adult years as simply that exercise. And we're all kind of surprised when we don't understand why things go the way that they do. I'm constantly surprised. But the Lord doesn't leave us to our own devices. Doesn't just speak to us from a bramble bush. There is fire inside, and this is so key, so important to understanding how the Lord leads us. The fire represents his love that is constantly burning towards us. As the book Divine Love and Wisdom says, the way that it begins, the Lord's love is constantly pressing to be received, seeking to be conjoined with us. And so we have this burning bush and this fire representing the Lord's desire at every stage of our life to draw us near to him. So every time the workings of providence is, it's from love by means of truth or by means of wisdom. But the motivation every time is from a place of love. So the brambly part doesn't mean, as is the case in each stage of life, there are delightful things about each stage of life that we go through, as well as challenges. So we're already talking about the challenges of adult life, of trying to figure things out, trying to figure which way's up and which way's down based on what we've learned. But there are also some constants. Obviously, the Ten Commandments, the Golden Rule, turning the other cheek. There are things that we know as we go through adult life that we need to stay true to. But what we're doing again in adult life is trying to sort through the contradictions and the difficult parts of what happens in our life. So we read that the fire is the Lord's love, an intense love that fills a person's inner levels with warmth. So this decision-making in our adult life is one that's about finding our fire, finding our love, our passion. And it really is a choice about what to love. Since love, heavenly love, is a decision, it's not a feeling. Throughout those struggles of those 40 years of our adult life, what we are doing is using those truths that we've learned about and struggling with them and using them, these truths from the Lord's Word, to decide to decide what it is that we love. So let's turn to the objections, Moses' objections to this call. It's interesting when you look at the internal sense, Moses has been living in the land of Midian. He's an adult now, he's married, he's got children, and he has a job, simple shepherd life. And living in the land of Midian corresponds to a time of simple good. And we're not told the thought process that Moses might have been going through as a young adult at that point, or maybe an older adult. But he likely wasn't thinking much about his old life in Egypt, or the suffering and the slavery of his own people. And this all changes with that call, because the Lord is calling him back to the land of his birth, to his people, to be the leader for them. And so his heart is stirred to face life back in Egypt. And so you can imagine that as a jolt when we're trying to figure out in our adult life what our calling is. What are we trying to do here? What's important? What matters? It's a bit of a jolt. And so the call to Moses is, "Come now, therefore, says the Lord, and I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." And this is where the battle begins, the objections. Who am I that I should do this? Suppose they won't believe me. I'm not eloquent. Send someone else. Sounds like the struggles that we go through in adult life. Yes, we have a lot of responsibility, a lot of freedom. We really can do what we want. But it can also be a struggle. So this reference back to Egypt, and this is where Moses is headed, takes us in this exchange and this process that we're going through in adult life, in our exchange with the Lord, to slavery in Egypt. And this is why we have these battles, is that we are slaves to unhealthy thoughts and feelings. No surprise there. But let's again think about where the Lord's coming from, that fire, that burning desire to draw us toward happier and happier things. The Lord says right in the text, "I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows." So the Lord understands our struggles. He understands, he hears our cry, just like he did with the people of Israel. And this struggle in adult life, we've probably talked about this before, and you've heard about this before, in terms of temptation or trials, that spiritual temptations or trials are an attack on a good love. There would be no issue, there would be no misery, there would be no pain, no crying out, if it wasn't good things that we're fighting for in our adult life. And so there's a passage like this that says, "When people who are governed by good loves are plunged into falsities, they experience feelings of anguish and anxiety. They suffer torment, for they love truth and loathe falsity, and are thinking all the time about salvation and about how unhappy they will be if those falsities get the better of them." And one way to think about falsities is simply lies. They're just lies, constant lies from the hells. Lies about the Lord, that he doesn't care about you, he's abandoned you. Lies about other people, that they're not worth it, don't bother with them. And lies about us, you're not worth it, you're not good enough. And so we can be tormented and enslaved by these lies. And this is what spiritual temptations are, an attack on a good love anyone who is not fighting for good things is not going to have, there's going to be no struggle. There's no difficulty there, no pain. It's only when we decide in this process about what it is that we're going to love and what it is we're going to stand for that the attacks come. And these attacks come on marriage and family, on our sense of usefulness. They come on our desire to do better and learn from our mistakes. And that's the only reason why there's a battle. Something that we love, something that we know is worth fighting for, is being attacked. So with these added details in mind, let's think now in the context of this adult responsibility, like Moses, of being called or being led by the Lord to turn aside to see this great sight. This is the first step in our process of self-reflection, is to be curious and to start thinking about things on our own, drawing distinctions, arriving at conclusions that are not those of others, but our own. And then the second step of removing those sandals. This is, as adults, the removing of the sandals, the reflection, is such an important part of our adult life. Think about coming to church or for worship. The purpose of worship is we come into this sacred ground, this sacred space for meditation, because it's the only way that the Lord can penetrate through our mind to the level of our mind that is receptive to what he teaches us. The state of understanding or the state of adulthood begins when the inner levels of our mind are opened towards heaven. So in our adult years, there is this desperate need and call to rise above our senses, to rethink our lives, to rethink our priorities. And the barrage that we're up against is this relentless pursuit of happiness, the pressure from without and within to indulge selfish and material wants and needs. And this is part of the battle, part of the challenge, because it cancels out higher purposes and the common good. It gets us to focus on self instead of our neighbor. So let's turn to that fire again, thinking of the Lord's love and the drive behind that love to lead us toward happier things. What does it take for us to find our fire? Well, as adults, I think we all have the knowledge that we need. And as we've been saying, we must decide who and what it is that we will love, for this will determine our future happiness or unhappiness. And so think of these questions and think of your answer to them. What do you love more than anything? What do you want in your life? What makes you tick? What are you all about? How do you show and receive love? And this is, again, where the struggle in adult life is leading towards. It's the Lord getting us to think about what is important to us. Where are we going to draw the line in the sand? What are we going to make a priority? I just want to mention a book that came out a long time ago, maybe 20 years ago, maybe more, called The 5 Love Languages, and by the author Gary Chapman. The 5 Love Languages. And I think this is a useful book to sort of help us get thinking along the lines of determining our love. What is it? What's important to us? What are we called to do? And this author talks about 5 love languages: quality time, words of affirmation, gifts, acts of service, physical touch. And he goes on in this book to explain how different people have different things that fill their cup. So just taking a few, like quality time or words of affirmation or gifts or acts of service. These are all different types of ways that we experience love and want to be able to give love. For some people, it's all about doing things for other people. For some, it's about spending quality time with them. For others, it's doing or making things for other people, gifts. And so it's a useful book because it gets you to think about, well, what is my love language? What am I all about? What feeds me? What fills my cup? So I'd like to end by thinking about this call. Like Moses, the Lord calls us to do a job. But what is this job? I'd like to suggest that this call is not a one-time event. It's not a call to discover our eternal use. As New Church people, I hear this quite a lot, that we beat ourselves up for not being able to figure out what our eternal use is. And I say, don't worry about that, because the Lord will lead you to your eternal use. Work on your loves. What is important? That's the call. The call from the Lord in adult life is to help us figure out what it is that we truly want in life. That's it. And it's not necessarily an easy path, which is why we have that 40 years of symbolically wandering in the wilderness, because our loves are ever changing and shifting and stretching and morphing. And as we struggle to figure these things out, we're peeling back the layers. And we really need to ask ourselves, well, what do we want our ruling love to be? Because it is our choice. The ruling love is not something that just gets handed down to us. It happens in the trenches, in our adult life, figuring it out what it is that we want. When you move to the New Testament, we find out that the call that the Lord makes to each one of us becomes very clear. It's about other people. It's not about us. It's about the neighbor. It's about loving the Lord and loving the neighbor. And that gives us a focus. I want to share this teaching as we conclude. The Lord's presence with us first becomes possible when we love our neighbor. Within love is the Lord, and so far as we have love, the Lord is present. Moreover, so far as the Lord is present, he talks to us. That's a beautiful thing to remember, and it is about the neighbor. It is about finding ways to serve the neighbor, and we all have different ways. We all have different love languages. We don't all have to be funneled through the same type of process. And in seeing providence in these stages, in this call, let us remember, especially with Moses, when he objects and starts coming up with the objections as to why he's not the right person, just think fast forward to all the things that happen. Moses, after receiving signs from the Lord to demonstrate that he'll be with him, agrees to this call. But little did he know all the things that would happen in that journey of leading them out from Egypt into the wilderness. And yet each time, and this is the way I'd like to end, each time the Lord has an answer as he leads us from a place of love to happier and happier places, to greener pastures. As he spoke to Moses, he speaks to us. Each time we have these objections, and his answer is, I will certainly be with you. I will be with your mouth and teach you what to say, and I will teach you what to do. Amen.